Hello everyone, welcome back. History with Hilbert here, and today I'm going to be doing a video about the Gauls, because as you might know if you watched my video of exploring a Gallic oppidum, which you can find in the description below if you haven't, I was actually in the south of France for the summer holidays, which is where the place which was inhabited by the Gauls before they were conquered by the Romans. Now, one thing I'd like to say before I begin is that whenever people talk about any Celtic peoples, they tend to whisk over the culture, the lifestyle, and language, and then they spend far longer talking about how the Romans set about conquering them and then putting down their futile rebellions with seeming flawless ease. But in this video, I'm going to try and avoid the Romans as much as possible, which, when doing a video on the Gauls, is like talking about stables without mentioning horses. It's hard. But I feel that the Gauls are an interesting enough people without comparing them to the Romans who eventually conquered them. Now, I was in the Auvergne region that over 2 millennia ago was the home of the Arverni people. And the Arverni was one of the tribes that made up the Gauls, which which is the modern English for the Latin word Galli, which is the name given to them by the Romans. Now you can see straight away that my first point about the Gauls is involving the Romans, so I can't even say the name without referencing Julius Caesar, because he's the one that tells us this. Now, what's important to understand about the Gauls, and in fact all Celtic nations and peoples at the time, is that they were never one nation like England or France is today, but rather a collection of tribes with common ancestry. If you think of it like a country's football teams, when the World Cup comes along, the best players from each nation will form the country's national team. But most of the time they're playing for their respective clubs and trying to score goals against each other. And I like to see the Celts in a similar sort of way. They each had their teams, then they would compete against each other, but then these would be their tribes, unless there was some great need to band together so that they were stronger in the face of an opponent. For example, when Vercingetorix rose up against the Roman occupation of Gaul, most of the tribes put aside their differences, at least for a while, to fight off this new invader. So some Gallic tribes would be larger than others, and generally speaking, if a tribe was larger than another, it was more powerful. So Celtic society was based on agriculture, and if you can grow enough wheat to make bread for 2,000 people, then you're going to get population growth, because then you can have more people. And with this population growth, you also get an expansion, as having more warriors means that you have a larger advantage over the enemy if your army is bigger. And the Arverni was actually one of the most powerful Gaulish tribes, and also one of the most powerful. The Arverni had a line of kings that gradually accumulated wealth and land by forcing their smaller, weaker neighbours to pay tribute to them. So the Valavi, Gabali, and Cadurci all paid unless they wanted to, be attacked or raided by the Arverni. So in this way, they forced these smaller tribes to end up giving them tribute of various kinds. So maybe in goods, maybe in wine or wheat or military service, something along those lines. The language spoken by the Gauls is often referred to as Gaulish because Gaelic is so similar to Gaelic, which is in fact the language spoken in different forms in Ireland and Scotland, though it is a different language than what was spoken by the Gauls, which is why we make this distinction by saying Gaulish rather than Gaelic. The Celts were an Indo-European people and spoke a distinct set of languages, notably the Celtic languages. And in fact, the way modern scholars define the Celts is through language. Now, for example, the Belgae living in modern-day Belgium and northeastern France might have more in common with the Frisi living in modern-day Netherlands, but because they spoke a Celtic language rather than their neighbours' Germanic language, they are classed as Celts. The Celtic languages are split into two main groups, nominally P and Q. Gaelic falls into P Celtic, as it is in the Gallo-Brythonic branch, along with modern Breton, Cornish, and Welsh. But what did a Gaul actually look like? The 4th century Roman writer Ammianus Marcellinus said of the Gauls, "Nearly all the Gauls are of lofty stature, fair and ruddy complexion, terrible from the sternness of their eyes, very quarrelsome, and of great pride and insolence." The Gauls took great pride in their appearance, and the type of clothes someone would wear would depend on their status in the tribe. Most men would wear a rough woolen tunic with a belt and tartan trousers beneath. The nobility would wear a torque, which is a twisted metal band that was worn around the neck as a symbol of rank. Most people would have lived in small villages or farmsteads, the larger centres being hill forts, and then a bit later on we see the introduction of these urban centres called oppodas. And in these oppodas, the local leaders would have conducted trade and the affairs of the tribe. Now, this is a key difference between the Gauls and some of the Celtic inhabitants of Britain and Ireland, which I didn't actually know before I started doing my proper research, so you might not know either, is that unlike in Britain and Ireland, where they're famous for building roundhouses, the Celtic roundhouse, in Gaul and much of mainland Europe, the Celts actually built rectangular houses. Now, apart from that, they're fairly similar to the British Celtic tradition and architecture, if you can call it that. The walls would have been made of wattle and daub, which is a process of creating a lattice of thin branches within which mud was dried and held in place. There wouldn't have been any windows, and the combination of the central hearth and the thickly thatched roof would have made the interiors very dark, very smoky. But that's ideal for drying fish and meat from the beams above the inhabitants' heads. In the times of war, people would drive their cattle to the nearest hill fort, some of which would have been large enough to house several village worths of people, whereas others were specifically designed to take in just a few families until the threat had passed. And you can call some of these places hill forts, but there are other names as well. Like I believe in Scotland, the Picts built what's called, I think, a brannoch or a crannoch. I can't remember the exact name, but it's basically a stone tower where you lock the door and then that's it. Nobody can come in. But it's this idea of defense for a community of people. Opera tend to come around about the 2nd century BC as a result of the flourishing trade networks that drove the Celtic economy in Europe. An oppidum was a large population centre where goods were made, stored, and exchanged. In fact, the word oppidum comes from the Latin ob pedum, meaning an enclosed space, as oppida were often fortified with perimeter palisades and ditches. Important decisions were taken in such places, and they were seen as the centre of a tribe's power. So that's maybe where the warlords and the higher up figures in Gallic society would meet. The Gauls followed the same religion as the rest of the Celtic world, a loose pantheon of gods, goddesses, spirits, and other worldly beings that stalk the land in sacred places, such as rivers or fens. Now, unlike the polytheism of the Romans, the religion of the Celts would be better described as being animistic. They believed in the presence of the ancestors and the spirits around them, guiding them and coming to them in the form of animals, the most revered of which being the boar. This symbol is often associated specifically with the Gauls, and it often appears on their metalwork and artwork in general. The Druids were a special religious class among the Gauls, holding a considerable power in every aspect of their lives. They educated the aristocracy and had a hand in declaring war and in the peace process thereafter, making them very powerful people. Because, of course, if they can get an idea of the future, they can ask the gods. They can cast the animal bones. They can see, if we attack this place today, will we be victorious? Then they're very powerful because the leaders, the war chiefs who, they control the armies, they have an ear with them. So the Druids in Gallic society were very, very important people. Most Gauls were farmers, and they reared cattle in the form of sheep and these large ancient breeds of cow that aren't around anymore because they've died out or the cows have evolved. But as well as this, they also harvested crops like wheat, corn, and various types of grain. They could obviously collect milk, cream, and cheese from their cows and goats and make bread and mead from their grain. The rivers provided trout and salmon. Those Gauls living on the coast had access to oysters, clams, and obviously larger marine life as well. Though large parts of Gaul had been deforested due to the agricultural revolution brought in by the Hallstatt culture, there were still substantial areas of woodland that yielded deer, boar, and bison, among other types of game. Because remember, 2 millennia ago, France looked very different to what it looks like now, and there were lots of ancient species of animals that only really were hunted to extinction after the Romans had come and after the Franks and the medieval era got going. In Gallic society, the warriors were an elite class. Not everyone could just pick up a spear and go off to plunder a neighbouring farmstead. It's thought that the warrior class was mostly made up of the sons of the nobility, they being the only ones with enough gold to pay for expensive swords such as have been found dating back to this period. The swords were expensive because, unlike a spear or an axe, which do not require as large amounts of metal and can be used for other activities like hunting or chopping wood, a sword uses up more metal, and its sole purpose is killing an enemy, probably a human because they're not really suited for hunting animals. Other battle regalia included the iconic semicircular shield, the Montefortino style helmet, golden necktalk, and tartan trousers again. The champion was an important part of early Celtic warfare, an esteemed warrior who would fight in single combat against another such champion and determine whether their king won or lost a dispute between the tribes. It's important to remember, however, that Celtic society was never static, and with the shifting of the Latin culture, the role of these champions declined as the population increased, which led obviously to larger armies and the production of shorter swords. These changes are easy to understand because an increased population means that more land is needed for farming to sustain this large amount of people, because obviously they all need to eat, which would lead to more conflict with neighbouring tribes because you can only start ploughing so much land until you nick land from an enemy and start hunting on an enemy's land or a neighbouring tribe's land. Then you become enemies and then you fight. So if a champion lost, it could mean a famine that would follow as the population would fall victim to food shortages. So chieftains wanted to put the most manpower they could into the field, and so they made spears and shortened the length of swords because this required less metal, which also indicates more of them were built as the population increased. The Celts and the Romans had very different ideas about fighting. The Romans fought battles either to defend their land or to conquer more land to settle on. The Gauls, although not against taking enemy lands when the situation was desperate enough, fought on a much smaller scale. Raids on farms to take cattle and slaves were far more common than full-scale attacks on hill forts or invasion of neighbouring tribal lands. The modern image of the Celts in battle as a disorganised rabble, each man seeking to gain individual glory against an organised, disciplined foe like the Romans or the Greeks, who were hopelessly outnumbered, still managed to decisively beat back this horde of screaming half-naked warriors using superior tactics alone. This image, however, is starting to be challenged by modern scholars. The accounts were all written by the victors, and we now know of several occasions when this was almost certainly not the case. For example, in 390 BC, an army of 12,000 Senones, a Gallic tribe that invaded Italy, defeated twice as many Romans at the Battle of Allia and proceeded to sack the city of Rome itself, only withdrawing after being paid a huge ransom by the terrified inhabitants. Towards the end of Gallic self-rule, the tribes around the Mediterranean coast become increasingly Romanized. The demand for wine is evident for the massive amphorae found predating the Roman conquest of Gaul, so we know that this must have come through trade because, well, the Gauls were still ruling themselves at the time where these amphorae have been dated. John Hayward, in his Atlas of the Celtic World, writes, "Wine drinking conferred such prestige that the Celtic elite of Germany, Gaul, and southern Britain had, through imports such as these, begun to adopt a Romanized way of life even before the Roman conquest." As well as finding many amphorae, archaeologists have uncovered drinking cups and jugs, likely traded through the Greek port of Massalia by Greek and Etruscan merchants. The founding of Massalia, which is modern-day Marseille, around the year 600 before Christ, started this exchange of Mediterranean ideas and customs into specifically Gaul, but also in a more broader sense, the Celtic society as a whole. Now in this region, the Arverni had several tin mines where they traded with the Italic traders for wine and wine-related goods, as archaeologists have confirmed when they found these Etruscan wine jugs at a Celtic burial site. The Romans conquered the already Romanized southern coast in the 2nd century BC and named it Provincia, meaning the province, for which the modern region of Provence is still named. Around this time, the Gauls, especially the southern tribes such as the Arverni, started to form tribal councils, and they started to also centralize power around Oppida. Centres such as Bibracte and Alesia became seats of power for newly appointed elected magistrates that oversaw the taxation of the rapidly increasing rural and urban population. And in fact, it's been estimated that the rural population of the Gauls in this time period was pretty much the same as it is today. It's even been suggested by scholars that the Arverni, after suffering a defeat in the south at the hands of the Roman legions, actually forced their royal line, their king, to abdicate and set up a form of oligarchy, at the heart of which would have been an elected magistrate. So it's even been suggested here that the Gauls were employing a kind of democracy at this late stage in the civilization. The most successful of these centres started to mint coins, keep food reserves, and even conduct censuses of the local population a century before the Romans took over. Now, as the social structure changed, so did their religion, with the appearance of large temples at places such as Ribemont, Neuville-en-Soulier, and Source de la Seine. Even the practice of formal burials halted, except in the northernmost reaches of Gaul, amongst the Belgae, for whom Belgium are named today. Undoubtedly, the Druids had a strong and influential hand in steering the social and religious changes that swept through Celtic society in the 1st century BC, being as they were at the heart of the Gallic society. Despite these developments towards centralized government, religion, and eventual statehood, the Romans still despised the Gauls after their destructive raid on Rome over 3.5 centuries before, and mockingly called the land north of Provincia Gallia Comata, long-haired Gaul. Unfortunately, the increasingly advanced state of Gaul was making it a more profitable target for expansion. The centralization of government and the system of taxation not being dissimilar to their own meant that a takeover could prove simple and efficient for the Romans. It would take Julius Caesar and his legions just 8 years to conquer the Gauls, before the process of destroying the proud history and the image of the Gaul could begin. Thank you very much for watching this video about the Gauls. I really hope that you've learned something new or that you've been inspired to do some further research into the topic. I'd like to say a big thank you first of all to Metatron for helping me with the pronunciation of some of the Latin words in this video, and I would strongly advise that everyone watching go over to his channel and subscribe if you haven't already, because he's a really great guy. He's got some really interesting videos and he's a great YouTuber, so absolutely recommend subscribing to his channel and to mine if you found it interesting. I'll be returning shortly with some more videos on history and linguistics, so please do tell me how you found this one in the comment section below, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.